All right, on to topic number one. So last week, Samsung had their Galaxy Unpacked event, I guess their first one of 2023. And as is typical fashion, they unveiled their S23 phone. So we got the S23, the S23 Plus, the S23 Ultra. And, we've talked about this lineup of phones a few times on the podcast already because everything pretty much leaked about them,
Mhm.
right? There was the design leaked and then the specs leaked and everything that leaked seemed to be true, right? Especially when it comes to the design, right? The camera bump that was kind of on the back of the phones, from S21 and S22, it's now gone, and it's essentially just the actual camera, lenses or camera elements themselves that kind of poke out the back of the phone. So it's a lot more minimalist. It looks a lot more like the S23 Ultra because, before the S23, or I guess the S22 Ultra looked very different when you compared it to the S22 and S22 Plus. So now all of their phones kind of share the same design language. The S23 Ultra, as we said in the past, it gets 200 megapixel sensor. That was leaked. We saw that come in. Everyone saw that come in. And yeah, so not too many surprises at this event. I guess the one thing that was, I don't know, not a huge surprise, but they came out with their Galaxy Book 3 Ultra, which, the Galaxy Book 3 devices, their flagship laptops, but they now have an Ultra line for the Galaxy Book. So it's their whole thing was Ultra is the best that we have to offer. This is the best of the best. And yeah, I don't know. Nothing too exciting if you ask me. I like the phones. Nothing too exciting in terms of specs because we do everything. In terms of design was too exciting. But we got a Galaxy Book Ultra, which I guess is cool. I don't know. What are your thoughts on the event?
Yeah, so I didn't watch the event. It was one of those things where I from Samsung events in the past, I've found them kind of boring and they kind of drag on quite a bit, and they start talking about things that I don't think most people find all that important. Like, we want to get to the details of like what these new products are. And I think the reason for that is Samsung releases so many products throughout the year that have all these little incremental steps that, especially in a year where a phone isn't going to change the world in terms of what's different between this year and last year, they kind of have to start talking about things that aren't really all that important. And Apple does this a little bit too, but they're really good at being able to, play up something like cinematic mode, like a piece of software or a dynamic island in a presentation to get people excited, even though I'm still one of those people who think a lot of those features are very much gimmicky kind of things that don't need to be talked about. I think Samsung can kind of get lost in the same kind of conversation. That being said, I think there's a lot of people who are a little bit bored by these devices, but I actually think these devices are more interesting than maybe we give them credit for in today's landscape of cell phones. Because if you compare something like the S23 base level and the S23 Plus, there are some design decisions there that are different from last year. Like, a little bit less of a curve on the metal rails and stuff like that, or, the difference between the camera bumps and a really significantly updated chip compared to last year, which is something we didn't see from the base level iPhones this year. So in a year of where new phone models have been relatively boring, especially in the flagship phones of the year, like an iPhone, I think Samsung has done a really good job of making these phones seem cool, because the reality is, if you have an S22, you're not getting an S23 unless your phone broke. So this is for people who are looking to upgrade from a phone from a while ago. So you are getting a slightly different design. You are getting a more minimalized camera kind of feature on the back. You are getting an updated chip that's significantly more powerful and significantly more power efficient, which are all things you did not get on the new iPhones. So, yeah, I actually kind of like what the line of these phones have done, but I do have some criticism as well. Like, obviously, it's still not the most exciting thing, and I think what kind of really lets it down for me is, if you're not going to do a huge redesign of these phones in terms of the design, or like a new software or hardware feature that's going to get people excited, do something cool with the colors. And they didn't do that here. We got the same lavender from last year. We got the cream. We got the phantom black. And we got a new green, which is cool. I kind of like the green. But, it felt like they could have done something a little bit cooler with these colors. And there are some exclusive colors on Samsung.com where you can get this lime green color that almost reminds me of maybe a Nike lime green that they kind of had that signature color in the past, at least in the 90s, and like a graphite gray. Both of these colors are, in my opinion, still kind of boring. They're not really all that interesting. So I don't know. It's one of those things where I wish if they weren't going to do something crazy with the design, at least try to do something with the colors of the phones to kind of make them a little bit more interesting. But I also do want to give an extra shout out to the S23 Ultra. Once again, minimal design changes from last year, but I think their rationale for the changes that they've made to this phone makes sense. So, if anyone remembers, Samsung does this interesting thing where their screens kind of curve over the edges. And it started with the Galaxy Edge back in the day, where it's just one side that curved, and it was really dumb, weird device. But then they kind of brought that into their main line with the Galaxy S6 Edge and stuff like that, where the screen would kind of curve over the edges and make these really minimal side bezels.
The waterfall edge.
Waterfall edge,
they
yes,
called it.
Yes, and there used to be like some features that you can have with that, where you would have like some apps that you could drag in from the side, and you'd get like some notification stuff. Kind of similar to what the Surface Duo 2 has done, where when the display is closed, you can kind of see a little bit of the edge of the display where you can get some notification information. Samsung used to do that back in the day as well. But, it's not necessarily the most usable, and especially on a device where you have a pen. So what they did this year is they talked about, okay, we're still going to have the glass curve. So it's like this kind of seamless thing, which is something I've always really liked in premium phones, where it's almost like a seamless transition from the glass of the screen to the metal rails on the side. It makes it feel very smooth and very premium, but they kept the screen still flat. So when you're using the S Pen on the screen, it doesn't feel like your pen is going to slide off the screen. It's still a pretty flat kind of surface, which I think is kind of cool. And that's the logic that they brought for why they made this change. And I think it makes sense. And overall, I do think the S23 Ultra's design and the S22's Ultra's design, which is just a Note design, essentially, the Note 20 and the Note, I guess, 10, that design that they just carried forward. I think it's a great design. And I shouldn't say I hope, but I wouldn't be mad if they brought this design to the Galaxy S series, like the S23 and the S23 Plus, in the future, because I just think it's a really nice, utilitarian kind of design for a phone, that looks good as well. So yeah, I think all these devices are pretty cool. The specs I think are interesting here. So the S23, the base level, it's a nice, small, compact phone. And I think we've talked about in the past, we've liked the fact that they've gotten these more compact phones, as their base level, kind of similar to the base level iPhone. But yeah, you get things like 8 gigabytes of RAM between the S23 models, up to 12 gigabytes in the S23 Ultra. You get the 50 megapixel main camera on both the base level S23 phones, so the S23 and S23 Plus. The one big difference between the S23 and the S23 Plus is the S23 Plus starts with more storage. So it starts with 256 gigabytes of storage over the 128. And it has faster charging. So it has 45 watt charging support as opposed to 25 watt charging support on the S23 base. So the S23 Plus has 45 watt. The base has 25 watt. And the Plus also has a larger battery with 4,700 milliamp hours. So some small changes here, but just remember, none of these phones come with chargers in the box anyway, so kind of frustrating in that way. But if anything, I think this is interesting because the S23 Plus and the S23 Ultra have more in common, whereas they both have the 45 watt charging. They have similar battery sizes with 4,700 milliamp hour for the S23 Plus, 5,000 milliamp hour for the S23 Ultra. But the big difference between the two, and I'm kind of curious to get your impressions here on whether or not you think this is going to kind of work in terms of being a great camera. But like I mentioned, the base level S23 phones have a 50 megapixel camera, but the Ultra has a 200 megapixel main camera. I don't know what that means. I mean, Samsung has tried these high megapixel counts in their cameras before with mixed success. Do you think this is potentially the year that they pull it off, and the 200 megapixel camera is, far better than a lot of the competition out there? Because some of the early impressions seem to be really impressed with this camera overall.
Yeah, I think this is the year that they make a big jump in terms of their camera performance. I mean, for some time previously, they were one of the best cameras out there,
Hmm.
right? It was always between Apple and some Samsung as to which would take the better pictures. But then Google came out with their Pixel line and they completely changed everything. But for the past while, Samsung hasn't been as good. Not to say that they take bad pictures, just not as good as the other two.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean, with this large 200 megapixel sensor, it's not taking 200 megapixel photos. It's mostly been in down to, I think, 16. It's mostly been in 16 pixels together. So it's going to take like 50 megapixel photos, but it's just those 50 megapixel photos they'll have a lot more information. They'll be able to take in a lot more light. So when you compare like a 50 megapixel from the S23 Ultra to the S23 Plus, it should look better on the S23 Ultra.
Hmm.
One thing we didn't mention, these are all using Snapdragon 8 Gen 2s, but the Ultra actually has like an overclocked version. So I think they marketed it as the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 for Galaxy, which is only going to be on the Ultra. So there's nothing different architecturally with the chip, but it's been overclocked. So it has higher capabilities than the S23 Plus will, than the S23 will. So, I mean, with that alone, I would expect to see some better camera performance. But now, all with the overclocked chip, with the 200 megapixel sensor, I'm expecting to see even more camera performance. Yeah, I don't know. I'm looking forward to see the full reviews of these and to see how well the camera has improved compared to the last generations, and to see if they finally close the gap to a Google and close the gap to an Apple.
Hmm.
And I think a couple other things that they brought, I believe it's 8K at 60 frames per second, which is coming for the first time to Galaxy phones. I think to most phones, really. I think, kind of the standard right now is 4K. So, I mean, the fact that they're filming things in 8K, I don't even think that the Samsung Galaxy can play things in 8K. So you're going to have to export that to a computer that can handle that, or export that to some other device that can handle it. Also, so the selfie camera was 40 megapixels on the S22 Ultra. It's been downgraded to 12 megapixels. So that's an interesting thing also. Bump up the rear camera, you kind of bump down the selfie camera. I guess maybe from their experience, they've seen that, hey, people don't care as much about taking selfies. People are using their rear cameras a lot more. Or maybe their image processing has just gotten better with selfie cameras. And they're like, hey, we don't need as big of a sensor. Because, you see people like the likes of Google, where on their Pixel 6a, they actually went back to the old camera sensor that they've been using for years and years and years, and it's still spitting out really great photos. When you look at MKBHD's blind camera phone test, right, that was one of the best. I think it was number 2 or number 1 in terms of voting, and that's a sensor that's probably like 5 years old, a 12 megapixel that's 5 years old, and it's all just thanks to the image processing that they do after the fact. So yeah, I mean, maybe 12 megapixels is all you really need to take a good photo, and 200 megapixels is what you need to justify selling new phones year after year after year.
Yeah, I think that's 100% it. I think, and I wouldn't be surprised if the 200 megapixel cameras get you fantastic shots, just because of how versatile it can be. Because even, they talk about the zoom features, right? You still get the 3 times optical zoom, so not digital, but optical zoom. You also get a 10 times optical zoom on the S23 Ultra with that 200 megapixel camera, as well as their 100 times space zoom, which is a digital zoom, so to speak. And I guess you can take advantage of those features with those high end cameras on the rear. But when it comes to a selfie, what you really need, because you're not holding it really all that far from your face, What you really need is the ability to capture a lot of light. And I imagine the smaller megapixel count and the larger pixels, especially for a camera or a camera sensor that's that small, I imagine that's much more valuable than the higher megapixel count. So maybe it could have been a situation where people were starting to notice worse selfies on the higher megapixel count. So they're like, okay, let's go backwards. Um, but yeah, I do think that that's really cool. The one thing I will say though, and I'm kind of curious to get your opinion on this. In the last version of the Galaxy Fold, the inner screen had the under display camera. Um, that isn't very good for taking selfies, but it kind of gave you that all screen look. Do you ever think those under display cameras get to the point where we don't need hole punch cameras anymore? And something like the Galaxy S23 Ultra or the S24 Ultra, S25 Ultra can get a full screen surface where we don't need the hole punch anymore? Or do you think maybe, the under display kind of camera tech, that was a shot in the dark they took with the Galaxy Fold, but the quality just isn't there. Maybe it's not viable for phones of this caliber.
I don't think it's ever gonna get there.
Mm,
I don't think yeah. I don't think it's ever gonna get there, and I don't think it ever needs to get there.
mm,
Like, it's a cool feature. It's cool to say, "Oh, hey, look, I have a camera on the front," but you can't even see that I have a camera because it's hidden behind the screen, and then it does this cool trick where, it makes the pic you can see through the pixels, and then it'll take a photo, and then it does all these algorithms and calculations, so you don't see the pixels in the final photo.
yeah,
But when you look at a hole punch camera on a screen, it's so small and it's so insignificant, and you don't notice it,
yeah,
right? iPhones have notches on the top, and people stop noticing them. So a hole punch is very easy to stop noticing, especially if you're watching any sort of content on your screen or if you're playing any games or whatever you're doing,
yeah,
right? So I think the hole punch is the perfect thing. It's so small, it's so out of the way. Now, whether you put that in the corner or in the top middle, that's okay, neither here nor there. But I don't think we will ever get to the point where an under display screen is as good as just a regular hole punch style.
yeah.
And I don't think we need to, especially just on regular consumer phones.
Yeah, I think you're probably right there because it's just extra layers for the camera to go through, and as someone whose current phone has like a pop up camera, I wish that was
Mhm.
something that stuck around. There was a short time where OnePlus did it, and Xiaomi did it, and Oppo and stuff like that. But it seems like everyone's just gone to the hole punch, and I imagine the popularity of the iPhone Pro's new pill shaped notch. Maybe we might see more companies copy that as opposed to trying to minimize it. Make it a feature as opposed to a bug. I guess
Mhm.
going forward.
And I guess the thing too, right? As camera technology progresses and sensors get smaller, but are able to still capture the same amount of light, that hole punch is going to get even smaller and smaller eventually.
Yeah.
Maybe, or maybe we've kind of reached the limit of, okay, we need a hole at least this size to let in this much light. But yeah, I'm fine with hole punches. I don't think we need under display cameras. And I guess just to touch on one thing you mentioned earlier, thinking that the S23 and the S23 Plus, or I guess maybe the S24, S24 Plus would eventually start to look more like the Ultra or take on the design of the Ultra. I don't want to see that.
Mm,
I like that they're separate. I like, that they're kind of taking hints from the Ultra, in terms of the camera layout and in terms of becoming more flat and a little bit boxier. But I like that there is a distinction between the S23, the S23 Plus, and the S23 Ultra.
mm,
I think the Ultra is designed perfectly for what it is, which is a Note, right? In their presentation, they even said like, "Hey, this was inspired by the Note," and they had Note on the screen and then like wiped it off and then put S23 Ultra. So they're finally admitting that yes, this is a Note. We're just calling it an Ultra phone,
yeah.
and I like that distinction that this is something different than our regular phones. Yes, it's the same software, and okay, we added a couple, an extra camera, an extra sensor here, but this is a Note. You have a pen with it. This is easier to hold in one hand because it's boxier, it's easier to write on the screen because it's more of a rectangle. So yeah, I like the fact that the Ultra is something different. I like that they're sharing the same design language, the same styles and aesthetics, but I like that they're still distinctly different.
Yeah.
Because then eventually, if we get, let's say, an S24 Plus with the same design, then people are going to say, well, why don't you just give us an S Pen with that too?
Yeah.
And why don't you give us an S Pen with the S24, just a regular version, right? I mean, if they do that, that'd be great for people that want an S Pen. But then there's also people that are going to say, hey, I just want a regular Samsung phone without an S Pen. I don't want to have to worry about losing this and getting something stuck in the S Pen silo. So I like that they're distinct while still clearly related. So yeah, I don't know. I kind of want them to stay separate.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that too. I think that that makes sense. I mean, I don't know if there's any design change coming in the foreseeable future for the S23 Ultra, but if they do redesign it, I don't know, there's still part of me that really likes the current design, and I know it'll get boring after a while, but I
Mhm.
hope it doesn't go away completely. Maybe there's some kind of phone that they can use that design with, or maybe you know what, they just find a way to make it better. So yeah, I don't disagree with you at all. I definitely see, like, yeah, it makes sense that the phone looks different and is actually offering you different features to coincide with that look.
I guess one thing that we haven't dived as deep into is the S or the Galaxy Book 3 Ultra,
Hmm.
right? This is their ultra, their super premium Galaxy Book. It features a 16-inch display, 120 hertz OLED, an H series Core i7 or Core i9, an RTX 4050 or 4070. I mean, this Samsung laptop is it's taking aim at the MacBook Pros, right? This is designed for creative professionals. At least that's how they market it, for content creators, for people who are doing graphic editing, people doing, photo editing, that sort of thing. And this is the best that you can have for a Windows laptop, right? When you look at a Core i9, when you look at a 4070 laptop GPU, it's a very capable device. And it starts at $2,399. So it's technically $100 cheaper than the base MacBook Pro 16-inch, right? So this is something that obviously, if as long as you're okay in both Windows and Macintosh, or you're okay working in both of those operating softwares, then this is something that you could cross shop against the MacBook Pro. But what are your thoughts on, just the raw specs of this device? I know specs and everything, but when you look at the 120 hertz OLED from Samsung, who makes amazing displays, right? They make displays for everyone else. They make displays for Apple. When you look at the Core i9, when you look at the RTX 4070, do you think do you think this has the potential to kind of pull people away from MacBooks and MacBook Pros?
No. So this device in particular, I find kind of weird. I think it's going to come down to what reviews say. First of all, it's a 16-inch device. I get that that's the new size. I'm not the biggest fan of that. Razer has been doing that, as well as Alienware. They've been going 14 and 16 as opposed to the 15 and 14 inches before, or 13 inches, which is fine. I get it. You get more space. But there's two kind of reasons that kind of concern me about this laptop. One, going with Intel processors, fine. I mean, you can usually get a lot more performance for the dollar from AMD right now, although Intel has been storming back. But then, we're really where you're going to get the biggest difference between these machines and something like a MacBook would be in graphics acceleration. And the chip in this machine, the RTX 4070, I have no idea what that means. Because a while ago, NVIDIA, they used to have this thing where it was called Max-Q, which was essentially their mobile uh, GPUs. And they use that branding so that that is not the same as the desktop GPUs. Before that, there used to be an M symbol at the end of those GPUs so that you knew it wasn't the same as the desktop. They've completely gotten rid of that in the past couple of generations. So you really have no idea what is actually in these machines. It's a 4070 in name, but it could be the performance of like something like a 3060. And we don't know. So it's one of those situations where it's kind of hard to say if this is really going to be something that performs well. It's a small, thin machine with an i9 and a whatever a 4070 means. Probably means that it's going to be a machine that's going to get hot, and it doesn't look like this chassis is big enough to cool something like that. Although once again, that remains to be seen. It's just physically, I don't understand how they're going to be cooling an i9 and a 4070. But then also for me, the biggest issue is going to be with chips like that. You know, Intel has battled back in terms of performance, but what they've really lost, especially to AMD and even incredibly dramatically to what Apple's doing, is efficiency. These chips are absolutely not efficient in any way,
Hmm.
shape, or form. So if it's a laptop that you want to do work with mobily, this is a type of machine that will probably get you like an hour and a half of battery life doing that, whereas a MacBook Pro could get you 10 hours. So it's going to be orders of magnitude less efficient than a MacBook Pro, and I think that matters. And I think if you are a person who's going to cross shop these two devices, even for someone who wouldn't, even for someone like me who's would much rather use a Windows based device, if I was in the market for a $2,000 machine, there is no way I would pick this up over a MacBook Pro. So yeah, it's stuff like this that kind of really I don't understand. And then if I go back, the Galaxy Book line doesn't have a great history. My personal favorite device, the old Galaxy Book, which was based off of the design of the Chromebook Pixel. Actually, not the Chromebook Pixel. What was it called? The Galaxy Chromebook. That's what it was called. The Galaxy Chromebook, which was this very thin, boxy, red kind of laptop. They made a blue version called the Galaxy Book that I loved. I thought that machine was really cool, but it couldn't cool anything properly. It was a very hot machine, and the internals would throttle very quickly. I think if Samsung went back to a design like that and just got really efficient parts to make an everyday laptop, something to compete with something like the MacBook Air, I think that's where they can kind of, be a little bit competitive with something like what Apple's doing. But these machines in particular, it's either go for a MacBook or check out what Alienware is doing, check out what Asus is doing, check out what Razer is doing. Asus even has some specifically designed machines for creative work that I think would do a much better job than these devices. But I think you did bring up a good point. Where these really do shine is with the screen, and maybe that's a part we can start to see trickle down into other products that aren't Samsung products. Because quite frankly, I don't think they do laptops great.
Burn.
Well, okay. I'll put that question back to you. Are you excited by this machine at all?
No,
Okay.
definitely not.
Okay. So I'm not
Definitely
crazy.
not. Yeah, no, you're not crazy at all. You're very sound, very astute. Yeah, it as someone who's more of a creative laptop user than like I'm not a gamer,
Hmm.
right? Maybe if I was someone who was into gaming, then it's like, wow, 120 hertz, wow, 120 hertz OLED. I think it's like a 2x AMOLED. They actually say, RTX 4070, whatever that means. Like you said, we don't know if it's a mobile or if it's equivalent to a desktop 3050 or something. Core i9. That'd be great if I was gaming and I was competitively gaming on my laptop. But like you said, even then, maybe I'll check out Alienware, maybe I'll check out Razer, maybe I'll check out Asus instead. So this doesn't really get me that excited. The fact that it's only $100 cheaper than a MacBook, than a 16-inch MacBook Pro. Well, personally, I'm probably more interested in the 14-inch MacBook Pro. And even if I did, okay, I spend $100 more, I know I'm going to get really good performance because I know what the M2 Pro MacBook Pro does,
Yeah.
at least from reviews and everything. And I'm probably going to get like twice, maybe three times the battery life out of the device,
Yeah.
right? Especially once I'm unplugged.